先很 summarize. And summarize. We are all greater than Frankl said, meaning not the individual. And when I did a survey, in the 80s, I asked hundreds of people, what people are meaningful, what people are thinking now. But all kinds of answers. Some people say, my meaning of life is my path. Or that can be eliminated because of less than 10% people will when you catch it, maybe passively, maybe even that. So when there are different individuals, different sense of meaning, but still can find out, we are built to categorize. It's able to find some categories and see the meaning. The way to read then the social meaning is important. And literature is quite consistent of some of the same reinvented like relationship, achievement, social intent, religion, they're all important. So we don't know what makes that meaningful. We can research. I'm defining real differences doesn't mean that we want to research. In terms of application, if those of you who have attended my meaning therapy workshop know that meaning can be applied to all kinds of life problems and growth. So, finalize that. Is anybody object to my pure definition? Okay, so do not say a new definition. I don't care anymore. New definition. Okay. The next question is, would it be to let's start again? Start. Would it clarify the definition of resilience? Let me tell you a story. When short, I dragged him to the book table. I said, have you read my book about human contribution? No. I said, better read it. We're going to have a chapter about the Bonanno controversy. And when I critique his idea of his definition of resilience, I said, your resilience, the capability of man, the definition. His definition is that resilience means people are relatively unaffected by the trauma, really pretty stable. I say, no, come on, my friend. People are very mad at you mean? Those people are not affected when the whole family could wipe out by tsunami. They're not affected. They're denial. They're in denial. Or they have no feelings. They're not human beings. So the traditional definition is that people feel shattered, they feel devastated, but they recover, don't bounce back, they actually become stronger. So that is the more common definition. Another definition of resilience is the more recent research shows that is that you got through terrible tragedy like 9/11 or tsunami or Japanese tsunami. You feel devastated, depressed, upset, and you stay there for several days. But you do better than other people who come through the same thing. You can bounce back, but you're still relatively more resilient than people who read on the bottom. So therefore, I'm asking gentlemen and ladies and gentlemen, and see, do you agree with Bonanno or Wong, or do your own definition of resilience? Okay. So,
I don't think that's what Bonanno said. I think, well, maybe he said it, but it's not what I read him writing. But be that as it may, I want to say, we don't know what resilience means, but then you'd make fun of me if I said that. Resilience is a difficult concept, although I think the meaning is clear. It is an eventual return to what you were doing. Everybody's affected in the short run. I like to say that people are resilient, but they're not invulnerable. So they're not coated with Teflon. Eventually they recover. Sometimes they do better than they started. So I think just a critique, and then I'll pass the microphone to one, is that that definition of resilience, I think, is pretty well agreed upon. And the trouble is when researchers start to talk about resilience, they confuse confuse their theoretical explanation of resilience with resilience. And so I'll read a paper and say, well, I measured resilience by giving an optimism scale. I go, well, no, you measured optimism by giving an optimism scale, and I suspect that optimism predicts bouncing back to where you were, but don't confuse being optimistic with that. And I think it's a terrible literature, which is a shame because it's a really important concept and people are not clear on their terms. It's also important to study resilience longitudinally, not retrospectively. Maybe somebody asked a question about synchronicity yesterday, and my flip reaction inside my head is synchronicity would be wonderful, then we wouldn't have to do longitudinal studies. But I don't think that's what the concept really means. So I didn't say it yesterday. It didn't get any laughs today either. So. Anyway, I'm done.
Well, I do think that Paul's description of George Bonanno's description of this description of resilience is accurate in that, from his perspective, it is this acute distress, and then relatively quickly, going back to baseline. And what's interesting about that, especially with relevance to meaning, is that that kind of resilience is negatively correlated with being changed by that experience. It's negatively correlated with saying that the self has changed or showing self-change in response to a traumatic event. So it tells us that may not be resilience the way many people think of resilience, because we think that it's about growing through some traumatic event.
Could I respond to that? I confronted Bonanno. He said he made the same criticism when he spoke to child development, the same criticism. So we agree with me. He doesn't have anything. He's not revising his theory now. That going down very low and coming back is resilient. He's not relatively unscathed. He agrees with me.
But and so I think, I don't know. I think resilience, in my opinion, applies more to children. I don't know about it. Who wants to be resilient? Whatever. Suffer. Go for it. Life is hard. I want to say, though, this idea of going back to where you were it only holds true for a Likert scale score, because the meaning of that number, like if you were a 6 before the trauma, and 6 years later you're a 6 again, but that 6 isn't the same 6 at all. And I think that people have this notion, that they're going to go back to who they were before, when that person doesn't exist. You can't go back. You've been changed. And I think that the sort of capacity to acknowledge one's vulnerability and changeableness, the ability to be affected, that's an ability, right? It is a vulnerability, but it means that you're able to be hurt and traumatized, and to allow yourself to be transformed by experiences. And where does that fit into some notion that you're going back to where you were? I think it's funny, right? There's this, on the satisfaction flag scale, there's this item, if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing, right? And do you give that item a 7 or not? And there's lots of ways you could do that. And one way would be to say, oh yes, if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing, because nothing bad's ever happened to me. Or because, oh, it's all good, right? You could come up with all kinds of ways. Or you could really think about your life, warts and all, and even things that you might regret, and say, but still, I'll take it, because there's no going back. This is who I am. And I think that level of social acceptance and mindful acceptance and those numbers, you never go back to who you were, right? And you go back, but you go on to be a new person who's sitting at 6 now or 7. And I think that I don't know that. I think suffering. I'm all for it.
So this makes me realize how scary it is for someone to read a scientific article, because I want to complete the box score and say that you misinterpreted George Bonanno's work. So we have two on both sides here. what he's saying is there's a missing piece that's really important about George's work, which is he's saying that time is a psychological dimension. And that's what we're saying as well. And that in the short term, in the aftermath of the traumas and loss, they're relevant, right? For one person, it's a fish, for other people, it's losing their parents, and their experience, the disruptions in their life is the same. In the short term, it's massive perturbations and oscillations in their experiences. And that's part of remaining a steady state in the midst. So in the midst of him saying, you're remaining this Teflon-coated skin, he's saying in the beginnings, really intense oscillations in your experiences. But I think for resilience, and this goes the same for meaning in life as well, that we have so many topics on this, I think we know more than we actually know. And particularly for resilience. Because when we look at resilience in terms of what do we know about people, where people were starting from, and where they were heading before this life disruption occurred. So what was their trajectory before this event occurred? We don't know that much, except from stuff from Todd and other people in terms of real longitudinal studies, in terms of where are we heading in the first place. We catch people in teenage years, in childhood, we have no idea what their trajectory was going to be before they lost their parents, before they were refugees, before they were sexually assaulted, before they had a bone marrow transplant. We have no idea what their trajectory was going to be. Now, when it comes to the actual research, even more in depth of, we think we know more than we know, all of the work by Veronika, which is fantastic theoretically, it all comes down to two things. This notion of, are you someone who is resilient? Or are you someone who recovered? Which is, your life fell apart. You suffered greatly. I don't aspire to it as much as Lori does, but I'm good for a lot of pain in my life, not necessarily something. So you suffered a great deal, but then you kind of return back to living a functional life. All we know from the literature today is changes in emotions and changes in life satisfaction. But those are just two strands of a very complex matrix of well-being. We have no idea in terms of your personality, how it alters over the course of experiencing life disruption. So think of, Chris's stuff on character strengths. We have no idea in terms of really what trajectory you were in terms of gratitude, kindness, wisdom, and in terms of how that was disrupted and then sort of reformed back where it was before. And then, as Laura was saying, it might be back as before, but the structure of your wisdom, the structure of how you express gratitude, the details actually matter. Is that you may be much more evocative when you're expressing your gratitude to someone else. And that's really hard to capture when you're doing research and just interviewing people and asking questions. We have no idea about in terms of people's social networks, not just your relationship with your romantic partner or your kids, but your social network. It might look exactly the same before and after a life disruption, but the actual, in terms of who's in there and where they are, and your intensity and intimacy of your relationships, they might be completely different. But overall, the average of number of important people in your life, average level of intimacy might look exactly the same, but the structural system might be totally changed. And so, what I would say about resilience is, and this is a beautiful thing at a scientific conference, accept this simple mantra: we know more than we think we actually know. The data does not tell us the story. It's as rich as our theories, our clinical work, how we talk about it to our friends. The data have not put up with that complexity, and this is a call to arms for better research.
I just want to add a little bit to that. In the 1980s, Susie and Huxley came up with a concept called rumination. And within a decade or so, that concept got generalized to a lot of other things. The post-traumatic growth people picked up the notion of rumination, but they changed the definition without even knowing that they did that. And so I think there's this parallel with resilience here, that resilience has a certain colloquial meaning, and George was defining it, and is defining it in a particular way. He's measuring in terms of symptoms of depression or anxiety or prolonged grief, and those are measurable symptoms. And when you show that there's a relatively flat line in terms of low levels of symptoms consistently from pre to post, yes, there are some perturbations, and he shows in in his talk the other day, that, yeah, people do fluctuate, but they come to, I can't remember the term he used, but they come to a stable place pretty quickly. So I accept that as a valid definition of resilience. It's different from your definition, and it's different from Sal's definition of hardiness / resilience that we spoke of this morning. But it's also a valid definition. You have to be careful that we don't conflate these 2 or 3 terms, because they are distinct.
The problem with all this that's going on is twofold. One is an excessive emphasis on happiness, and the other is an excessive emphasis on simplicity and data collection. The 2 things have led to this problem. Now, I'm so glad we're appreciating this problem, because life is not about happiness. That doesn't mean it's terrible to be happy, but basically, if life is by its nature stressful, and you have to deal with those stresses in order to grow and develop, sometimes you're going to be happy, sometimes you're not going to be happy. Okay? But the growth process will, in the long run, lead you to think that your life is what it needed to be, rather than you missed everything. Okay? So, we're getting at a very important problem. Theoretically, we need to emphasize the difference between happiness or optimism, which is a good example of happiness, and something more that has a more prolonged effect on growth and development. And that's what we call hardiness, what we can call other things, certainly. And also, we have to be much more careful and detailed about how we collect data. It isn't just enough to have questionnaires out there. You've got to really study people very carefully. If you study them carefully, you will know whether they've changed or not as a result of what's happened to them. And presumably, the ones who are really doing best are the ones who've changed as a result of what's happened to them, because of this inherently stressful nature of living. Okay?
I absolutely agree with this, and I have a feeling that one of the biases that reduce the complexity of the issue and push us toward a simplified decisions is trying to find the same dynamic regularities for everyone. So in fact, they may be quite different. In fact, in case when we have, for instance, post-traumatic growth, and the case where no growth just falling into trauma, there are different regularities. Well, there was a long time a prejudice that the individual happiness, the range of happiness can change. And there was such an illusion until Diner and others managed to differentiate the set. Yes, sure, for the majority this is the case. But for the minority, and rather substantial minority, it's different. They may lift their individual level of life satisfaction up to one standard deviation of the, or even more in the long run. So it's different for different people. And the role the meaning plays in those processes is also different for different people. In case of adversities, in case of sudden disruptions, crises, troubles, and so on, the world we lived in escapes from under our feet. We have nothing, no place to put our feet. So shepherd assumption, not just shepherd assumption, but the world is not should be relied on. And something must be found, some other place to rely on, some other point to live on outside this reality not to be trusted. And meaning maybe in some cases plays a role of such an independent point, to put metaphorically speaking, to put your feet on this place. I remind the very interesting memoirs of a Russian philosopher, cultural scientist, Grigory Pomeranz. He is old enough to take part in the Second World War as a soldier, unskilled soldier. Since the first year he was taken in the 1941 when the war came to Russia. He was sent with other students, groups of students, to the battlefield, and he reminded recently in a broadcast interview the feeling of total terror under tons of metal falling from the sky and nowhere to escape from those tons of metal and absolute loss of any orientation. But then he said that what really helped them to cope with this awful situation was philosophy. Philosophy they learned at the university, and philosophy became that independent point to somewhat apart from this reality, to place your feet and to assemble oneself, to reassemble oneself from this independent point. So transcendent values, meanings. So philosophy is very pragmatic. And Salvatore just showed that philosophy accounts, personal philosophy accounts for courage in case of fear, the state of fear of death, and it accounts for positive outcomes. Just possessing personal philosophy accounts for positive outcomes in facing death. So it's quite pragmatic. Well, and you see, this is the role of in different individuals, the role of meaning, the degree to which they are able to find those independent sources and providers. Quite correct.